I never thought I would tell this story. Life has a peculiar way of dragging us into its deepest shadows, places that most people avoid even in thought. But here I am, sharing something I never thought possible. This is no mere youthful adventure or that curiosity that often gets us into trouble. It's something much darker, something that changed my perception of reality, the invisible and, most frighteningly, what resides within us. It all started on a stormy night in Ravenhill, a town known for its stories and legends. But my friends and I had always been skeptical until doubt was no longer an option. We decided to explore an old manor house, which, according to local legend, had been abandoned for decades after a series of tragedies and unfathomable mysteries. Our interest wasn't in the supernatural or anything like that. In fact, we were running away from our own inner storms, seeking refuge from the pain of a recent bereavement. My friend James had lost someone very close to him, and somehow that abandoned house seemed like a place where we could forget, even for a few hours, the brutal realities we were facing. When we entered the mansion, the charged atmosphere and the almost tangible silence should have been enough to drive us away. But sadness sometimes makes us fearless in reckless ways. In the dusty attic, among forgotten objects and lost memories, we found an old Ouija board. Covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, it seemed to be calling us. At that moment, motivated by a force that none of us understood, we decided to use it. Not out of a search for answers from beyond, but as a challenge to our own skepticism, an attempt to prove that, even in the face of death, we were in control. The candles flickered as we placed our hands on the planchette, and the first message we received, a simple word we would never forget, would mark the beginning of a night that would challenge our understanding of everything we considered real. It was that night, under the roof of a mansion forgotten by time, that the line between our world and what lies beyond became dangerously thin. Having shared the introduction to our foray into that godforsaken place, I now find myself compelled to delve into the details that followed. Details I wish I could forget. The atmosphere of the mansion, already heavy from the storm outside and the weight of our grief, began to become even more oppressive. The shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, and the whispers that could once have been attributed to the wind now carried a sinister intent. After the Ouija session, an air of skepticism still hung over us, especially when I questioned what we had done. My insistence that something had been disturbed was met with derision. Didn't they feel it? The change in the air, the chill that seeped down to our bones wasn't just the storm outside. It was something else, something we had invited. But then the phenomena became impossible to ignore. Items disappeared and reappeared in impossible places. Unsourced whispers filled the dark corridors, and elusive shadows danced on the periphery of our vision. At first, we tried to find logical explanations, but the truth, no matter how hard we tried to deny it, was clear. We were not alone. The situation worsened when the storm completely isolated us. The electricity was cut off. Our only contact with the outside world disappeared, and the house became our prison. It was in this isolation that the first of us disappeared. Lily, always the bravest among us, had gone to check one of the windows that was banging incessantly against the wind. When her scream tore the silence apart, we ran towards her only to find the window open and the curtain fluttering violently in the wind. There was no sign of her, only the echo of her scream being lost in the storm. The frantic search for Lily in that labyrinth of despair was in vain. We found signs of a struggle, a broken vase, marks on the floor, but no sign of her. It was at that moment, with my heart pounding against my chest and fear creeping into every thought, that the truth became undeniable. We had played with forces we didn't understand, and now we were paying the price. Following these terrifying events, the house, which was already a scene of desolation and fear, became a stage for horrors that none of us could have foreseen. Every shadow seemed to hide unspeakable dangers, and the air was saturated with a terror so dense that it was almost palpable. We tried to convince ourselves that we were safe together, that the light from the candles we had scattered around the room would protect us from the darkness that surrounded us. But the truth was that we were all on the edge of the abyss, staring into the unknown. The events that followed tested the limits of our sanity. Unexplained sounds of footsteps in the corridors when we knew no one had moved. The whispering of voices that belonged to none of us, and fleeting visions of distorted figures at the edge of our vision. Fear became our constant companion, a cruel reminder of our vulnerability. In our attempt to leave that cursed place, we discovered that the entity we had awakened had no intention of letting us go. Mark, trying to force the front door against the fury of the storm, was thrown backwards by an invisible force. His cries of pain and the sound of his bones breaking echoed off the walls of the mansion, a grim warning that our captivity was far from over. We gathered around Mark, trying to somehow comfort him as he struggled with the pain. In that moment of despair, the reality of our situation became inescapably clear. Our attempts to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for what was happening, collapsed in the face of the brutality of our reality. We were trapped, at the mercy of a force we didn't understand, an evil we had inadvertently invited into our world. It was then that we discovered the diary. Hidden under the floorboards of one of the rooms, covered in dust and wear, its pages contained accounts of an ancient cult, of rituals and sacrifices made in that very house. The words, written in shaky handwriting, spoke of an entity that the cult sought to placate, a dark presence that we now realized we had inadvertently awakened. Reading the diary was a moment of revelation and horror. Our foolish actions had reopened a portal that should have remained sealed, and now the entity was free to claim what it believed was rightfully its. Faced with the horror revealed by the worn pages of that old diary, a glimmer of determination arose among us, mingled with fear and despair. With Mark seriously injured and Lily palpably absent, the reality of our situation was undeniable. We were trapped, fighting not only for our survival, but also for our sanity. The entity we had defied, now fully awake, seemed determined not to let us forget the price of our recklessness. That night, under the cover of an even deeper darkness, we made the decision to confront the evil we had unleashed. The diary, with its references to ancient rituals and symbols of protection, became our guide. We carefully drew the symbols on the walls and floor of the mansion, hoping they would serve as a barrier against the entity that was harassing us. Each stroke was a whisper of hope, a silent prayer that those marks would protect us from the evil that lurked in every corner of that cursed house. When the storm outside reached its peak, with lightning tearing through the sky and thunder drowning out our whispers of encouragement, we began the ritual. The electrically charged atmosphere seemed to reflect the tension between us, a physical manifestation of the impending confrontation. With heavy hearts and trembling hands, we called out to the entity, challenging it to face us under the protection of the symbols we had drawn. But the evil we were facing was not intimidated by our efforts. The candles that illuminated our circle were blown out by a gust of icy wind that had no natural source, and the shadows around us thickened as if they were feeding on our fear. It was then that tragedy struck us again. Sarah, who until then had been the voice of reason, the force that held us together, was snatched before our eyes, consumed by the shadows we had tried to repel. Her scream of terror was the last sound we heard from her, an indelible mark on our tormented souls. At that moment, we realized the true extent of our powerlessness. The ritual, our last hope, had failed. There were only James and me left, each carrying the unbearable weight of loss and guilt. The reality of our situation was clear. We were in a battle we couldn't win, fighting an evil that was as much a part of the house as the bricks that formed its walls. Darkness enveloped us, not just the physical darkness of the starless night, but a deeper darkness, the darkness of an ancient evil that we had inadvertently awakened. After the loss of Sarah, a desperate decision was made. James and I, driven by adrenaline and the fear of facing the same fate as our friends, found the strength in our desolation to attempt an escape. The storm was still roaring outside, as if nature itself was in agony, reflecting the chaos we were experiencing inside that cursed manor. With the symbols of protection failing and the entity surrounding us, our only hope was the light of dawn, still distant but desperately awaited. Escape was not without its own terrors. We ran through the dark corridors, the sound of our footsteps echoing, mixed with the whispers and laughter that seemed to follow us at every step. The house, a labyrinth of shadows and fear, seemed alive, its corridors narrowing against us, as if it wanted to swallow us up. But determination, born of desperation, guided us through the darkness. When we finally emerged into the open, the relief was palpable, but short-lived. The storm had ceased, leaving behind a silence that was almost as oppressive as the chaos we had escaped. The weight of what we had experienced crushed us, a mixture of relief at our escape and deep sadness at the lives we had lost. The reality of what we had experienced and what we had lost began to settle in, a haze of pain and guilt that we knew would never leave us. Returning to civilization was a surreal experience. The lights of the city, the sounds of everyday life. Everything seemed strangely alien. The people around us went on with their lives, oblivious to the abyss into which we had looked, to the evil we had faced. James and I shared a bond formed by terror, but also by survival. However, this bond was also a constant reminder of the darkness we had left behind, but which would never leave us completely. The police asked questions, lots of questions, but what could we say? How could we explain the inexplicable? Our stories, so incredible and full of horrors, were met with skepticism. We were left to deal with our traumas as best we could, but the truth was that we weren't prepared for the weight of what we had experienced. Society saw us as survivors of a tragedy, but we knew ourselves as something more. We were the marked. Those who had seen what should not be seen, who had touched the veil between worlds and been touched in return. Life after that night never returned to normal. The marks left behind were not just psychological. They wove themselves into the fibers of my existence, altering who I was. The police investigation into our friend's disappearance was shelved as an unsolved mystery. They examined the house, now a place of sadness and loss, but found little more than unanswered questions. The stories that James and I told, saturated with terror and the supernatural, were met with skepticism. How could they believe it? If we hadn't lived that horrible reality ourselves, we would have doubted it. My seclusion was an inevitable consequence. The world around me seemed distant, almost as if I were looking through a veil. People spoke, but their words sounded empty, unable to touch the darkness that now resided inside me. The nights were the worst. Sleeping became a battle because every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to that house, hearing the whispers and feeling the icy touch of that dark entity. They were more than nightmares. They were vivid memories, every detail etched into my memory with cruel clarity. In my search for answers, I immersed myself in studies of the occult and the supernatural. Old books and forgotten texts became my constant companions, each page a promise of knowledge that might, in some way, offer me a way to confront the darkness we had awakened. I learned about protection rituals, ancient entities, and the veils that separate our world from what lies beyond. But with each discovery, the reality of my situation became clearer. I had been scarred by our experience, and what we had faced that night was not willing to let me go so easily. James, for his part, began to show signs of wear and tear that went beyond the emotional. His health deteriorated, a physical reflection of the scars we both carried. It was as if the entity had left a part of itself with us, a presence that drained his life little by little. I watched helplessly as my friend turned into a shadow of who he used to be, each day weaker, each smile more forced. The sadness of this transformation was almost unbearable, a constant reminder of the price we had paid for our recklessness. And then came the revelation that changed everything. In the midst of my studies, I discovered that the entity that haunted us fed on fear and guilt, emotions that had become my constant companions since that night. With this realization, a new determination was born within me. I needed to confront this evil, not just for myself, but for James, and for the memory of our lost friends. I needed to find a way to close the dark chapter we had inadvertently opened. With the revelation that the entity fed off our fear and guilt, a plan began to form in my tormented mind. It wouldn't be easy, and the risks were immeasurable, but the alternative was to watch James wither away until there was nothing left of the friend I knew. I delved even deeper into my studies, searching for any shred of knowledge that could be the key to our salvation. I found references to an ancient ritual, something that could, if not banish the entity, at least contain it, preventing it from causing any more harm. The preparation was exhausting. Every symbol had to be perfectly drawn, every word of the incantation pronounced with precision. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of blood, but of something personal, something that meant renouncing the fears that bound us to that entity. For me, it was clear. I would sacrifice my memories of that night, the fear that had consumed me ever since. For James, it meant giving up the guilt he carried for the loss of our friends, a guilt that wasn't his to carry. The night we decided to perform the ritual, the air was charged with a palpable energy. The symbols were drawn on the ground, the circle of protection was complete, and everything was ready. With every word of the incantation, we felt the entity's resistance, a pressure against our minds trying to divert us. But our determination was stronger. We were fighting not just for our lives, but for the soul of our group, for the friends we had lost. The final moment of the ritual was of an intensity that words cannot describe. A light shone inside the circle. A feeling of warmth enveloped us. And for a brief moment, there was a peace that none of us had felt since before that fateful night. When it was all over, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the oppressive silence we had known, but a peaceful, almost sacred silence. In the days that followed, we noticed the changes. James began to regain his strength, his spirit revitalized in a way I hadn't seen for months. The shadows that had been chasing us seemed to recede, and the whispers that had been haunting us fell silent. The entity had not been destroyed. We knew that something so ancient and powerful could not be so easily defeated. But we had achieved a reprieve, a moment of respite that allowed us to start rebuilding our lives. But as we recovered, as James found the light in his life again, I realized that my journey was far from over. The entity had been contained but not banished, and I knew that the responsibility to guard against its return lay with me. I had started this, and now I carried the burden of ensuring that the evil we had unleashed did not find a new doorway into our world. James's improvement was a relief, a light at the end of a long dark tunnel. However, as he regained his strength, a sense of isolation began to grow inside me. The shadows may have receded, but they never left me completely. I knew that the entity was still there, lurking, waiting for a weakness to take advantage of. And this awareness became my burden, a constant vigil against an evil that only I seemed to feel. Over time, the gap between us became a chasm. James wanted to forget, to move on with his life, but I couldn't allow myself that luxury. Every shadow, every whisper of the wind brought back the terror of that night. I was trapped, anchored to that house and the entity we had disturbed. James and I began to drift apart, not for lack of love or friendship, but because my journey had taken a path that he couldn't or wouldn't follow. James's decision to walk away was a hard blow, but understandable. He needed to heal, to find peace, and I was a constant reminder of what we had faced. Our last conversation was charged with emotion, a mixture of goodbye and a silent wish that things could have been different. When he left, I let him go with my love and my blessing, knowing that we both needed to go our separate ways to heal. Alone, I turned my attention to watching the entity. The ritual had given us a breather, but it was only a temporary solution. I knew the battle wasn't over, it had just changed shape. I dedicated myself to learning more, to understanding the forces we had unleashed and how I could fight them. The house and the entity inside it became my focus, an adversary that demanded my full attention. As the months passed, I became a solitary figure, a silent guardian against an evil that most people didn't even believe existed. Rumors about the manor and about me began to spread, whispered stories about the man who fought demons. But these rumors didn't matter to me. My fight was more important. I had accepted my fate, knowing that the battle against the entity was now my life. I was the only one left, the only one who could keep watch, ensure that the evil we had accidentally unleashed could not spread. The solitude of this existence was a small price to pay if it meant protecting others from the fate that had claimed my friends. In my new life of isolation and vigilance, I realized that time passed differently. The days merged together, marked only by my routines of protection against the entity and the incessant search for more knowledge. I became a shadow among shadows, always alert, always waiting for the next sign that the entity would try to break through the barriers I had strengthened. Those who knew my story looked at me with a mixture of fear, pity, and fascination, but kept their distance. I was the marked man, the one who had seen beyond the veil and now carried the weight of that vision. Rumors and legends about the manor and about me spread through Ravenhill, feeding a new generation of dark stories. I heard of teenagers daring each other to approach the house, but no one dared enter. My presence, though reclusive, served as a constant reminder of the danger that resided within those worn walls. I had become part of the legend, a ghostly guardian of the threshold between worlds. This role of solitary watchman was not something I had chosen, but one that had been imposed by necessity. However, I accepted it, recognizing that my struggle could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The entity, although contained, was never truly silenced. There were nights when I felt it stirring, testing the barriers that kept it trapped. On those nights, my heart was heavy with the realization that the battle was far from over. I was all that stood in the way of this darkness spreading, and the magnitude of this responsibility was, at times, overwhelming. Over the years, this solitary existence forced me to reflect deeply on destiny, on the fine line between light and darkness. I had accepted my role as guardian against the entity, but I also began to understand that this fight was more than just about keeping an ancient evil at bay. It was an ongoing battle within myself, against fear, against hopelessness. Loneliness and isolation became not only conditions of my existence, but also means by which I found strength. Every day that passed, every night I faced was a victory, not only against the darkness that threatened outside, but also against that which resided within me. I had been transformed, forged by the fire of this endless struggle, and although the road ahead was uncertain, I was determined to carry on, the lone guardian of a frontier that few knew existed.